So you're enjoying the rain?
Before we go any further, we need to stop and talk about the Quileute tribe. Although the tribe is portrayed in the fictional world of Twilight, the tribe itself is very real. What isn't real is the way in which they are portrayed in the saga, especially the tribe's history. And not only was their culture appropriated and misrepresented, but they were never consulted about the series either. And in the 17 years, nearly 2 decades, since Twilight's release and the accumulation of over $3.4 billion worldwide, the Quileute tribe hasn't received compensation of any kind. In the description is a link for more information about the Quileute tribe and the mission to move to higher ground. The Quileute tribe lives in La Push, Washington, and a tsunami zone, which could wipe out the people and their culture. The mission behind Move to Higher Ground is to relocate and move to an area which is safer, protecting their people, culture, and practices. So check out the link in the description, and if you are able, consider donating. Also, be sure to share the link. Thanks, everyone. So last year I was reading this book called Midnight Sun. Yeah, that Midnight Sun where he says weird things like this. Anyways, it's Twilight from Edward's perspective. Do I recommend you read it? No, but I had a time. So anyways, while reading, I came across this passage which I will now recreate for you.
So, what kind of books do you like to read? I'm a vampire.
Little Women, Jane Austen, but not Emma, Jane Eyre, anything by any Brontë, To Kill a Mockingbird, Fahrenheit 451, all the Chronicles of Narnia, but especially The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Gone with the Wind, Douglas Adams, David Eddings, Orson Scott Card, and Robert McKinley, Alan Montgomery, Zane Grey, Shakespeare, but mostly the comedies, anything by Agatha Christie, Anne McCaffrey's Dragon books.
In her, she had a spoonful of Jane Eyre, a dash of Scout Finch, a spoonful of Jo March, a cup of Eleanor Dashwood, and just a sprinkle of Lucy Pensive.
And immediately, I knew what I had to do with this information. Obviously, read all of the books Bella has read and compare them to her characterization. Obviously. Now, a lot of creators have made videos like this before. One of my personal favorites is Jack Edwards, and I think it's so interesting to take an already fictional literary character and compare that character to its literary influences. It's like watching a bunch of 80s television and horror movies and then going and watching Stranger Things and seeing how they align. So because there are so many books that Bella enjoys, I'm not going to be able to get to all of them in this video. When I tell you this video has taken months to make, I mean it has taken months to make. If you haven't already noticed a pattern, Bella really likes classics. And the thing about classics is they're extremely long because back in the olden days, they had nothing else to do. Like, I don't blame them, okay? This was all they had to pass the day. Anyways, so I got to a point where I just really wanted to get this video out there, and I figured if I wanted to in the future, I'd just make a part 2. But in this video, I'm just going to try to get through the books that directly parallel and compare to the films and Twilight books. So with that being said, thank you for understanding. You already saw the title, let's get it.
Everything seems unreal. You saw almost phantom-like a role.
So when making this video, I thought I was going to start off by talking about Pride and Prejudice because Pride and Prejudice is the direct parallel to Twilight. That's probably what made the most sense to talk about. But then I read Jane Eyre and oh my god, my mind was blown. And heads up, in the description, I did leave time codes to when I'm talking about specific books because if you haven't read these books before, it's going to spoil things for you. So just want to give you... Okay, just a quick recap. Jane Eyre is the story of Jane Eyre, a young woman who grew up an orphan and is treated terribly by the people around her. I really liked it and rated it a 10 out of 10. I did want to score it just a little bit lower, like dock off a point, because I didn't like the ending, but I can't downgrade a book that I thoroughly enjoyed just because I didn't like the ending. And so I won't. Despite the bad ending, it gets a 10 out of 10, okay? It's a really cute story, for the most part, ish, kind of. Again, I didn't like the ending, alright? Like, come on, you expect me to believe... Jane deserved better. She deserved better. She had so much growth, and then Anyways, like Twilight, Jane Eyre is told from the first-person perspective, with Jane detailing her life to the reader. I think this is incredibly effective for both stories, especially in trying to sell the romance aspects. If it were from an outside, unreliable perspective, like what's done in Wuthering Heights, I don't think the relationships could be so easily romanticized, and it would be much more difficult to buy into any love story. If you think about Twilight for longer than 2 seconds, the whole situation starts to look a little messy. But because Bella is convincing us that she's happy and in love, then she's happy and in love, and who are we as the readers to stop that? I felt the same way reading Jane Eyre. I cannot stand Edward Rochester, and when she went back to him in the end, I figured as long as she's happy, then as the reader, I will be happy for her. But do I like it? No. And not only are the ways each story is structured very similar, but the characters themselves are incredibly similar as well. Because of this first-person perspective, you get a few different moments where Bella and Jane are comparing themselves to the other characters, and the ways in which they do so are incredibly similar. Like Jane, Bella will describe herself as plain and insignificant. Neither girl understands how the male love interest, whether it's Edward Cullen or Edward Rochester, could find her at all attractive or worthy of thought. Both girls are incredibly insecure, mostly because of their upbringing, and like Jane, Bella is a very optimistic, determined, and incredibly straightforward person. And I think this straightforwardness is what makes the book Jane Eyre and the character Jane Eyre so good and so effective. Although I would classify both as somewhat unreliable narrators, Jane Eyre especially, they're both incredibly honest characters, and therefore nothing about their account of things feels dishonest or even inaccurate. Now, we don't know things from the perspective of Rochester, and I'm sure if we got a Midnight Sun equivalent of his, he would just be gushing about this woman who came into his life, as he should. Jane is incredible. But even when reading Edward's perspective of Twilight, Bella's accounts of how things happened are fairly realistic and true to what happened. It's just happening from her perspective and her lens. One thing that did surprise me was how quickly Jane fell for Rochester. I figured it would take a lot longer than it actually did, which is very similar to the way that Bella quickly falls in love with Edward. I'm gonna read you a passage from a book, and you're gonna tell me which character you think would say this.
Is the wandering and sinful, but now rest-seeking and repentant man justified in daring the world's opinion in order to attach to him forever this gentle, gracious, genial stranger, thereby securing his own peace of mind and regeneration of life?
Drum roll, please. Thank you. Mr. Rochester said that, and the second I read it, I immediately thought of Edward. And here's just another example from the same character.
Never,
said he as he ground his teeth.
Never was anything at once so frail and so indomitable. A mere reed she feels in my hand.
And he shook me with the force of his hold.
I could bend her with my finger and thumb, and what good would it do if I bent, if I uptore, if I crushed her?
The characters of Mr. Rochester and Edward both have these very possessive tendencies over the people that they claim to love, and they also have a very similar cadence and way of speaking. In some ways, there are characteristics of, say, like a Mr. Darcy, where they tend to be more quiet and reserved and seemingly indifferent. However, where Mr. Darcy differs is he ends up being an actually good person and genuinely kind, and I'm completely 100% and utterly team Darcy.
I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him.
So let's say hypothetically there's this girl and this guy, and they're in love. So cute. But it turns out the guy is married and or a vampire. And the dude's like, we can't be together because I'm a vampire. And she's like, we can't be together because you're married. And they break it off. But then the girl starts spending a lot of time with this other guy who's like practically a brother to her. And then he catches feelings. And she's like, I don't reciprocate my guy, but thanks. Then she catches word that something terrible happened to the guy she is in love with. And she's like, oh my god, I gotta go be with him. So then they go and they save them. The end. Aside from the direct comparison to Jane Eyre and New Moon, the Twilight saga as a whole really reflects a lot of Jane Eyre in structure. In Breaking Dawn, Bella catches her reflection in her bridal wear and deems herself unrecognizable. In Jane Eyre, a young girl meets a guy who's much older than her, and they fall in love. When she meets him, he's mysterious and brooding and quiet. He has this whole other secret life that he's kept from her and that keeps them apart. Edward and Mr. Rochester shared the same name, which I don't think is a coincidence. These two also share a lot of similarities as characters, and both are very brooding. In Jane Eyre, it's revealed that Mr. Rochester is married to a woman by the name of Bertha Mason, which is significant because before becoming a Cullen, Edward's name was Edward Anthony Mason, which is kind of sad and ironic. It's a sad irony, I guess. There's also a character named Rosamond who's very similar to Rosalie. There's also the elderly widow Alice Fairfax, so although she's much older than Alice in Twilight, Alice is incredibly kind to Jane and looks after her. And it's sort of funny to consider Alice Fairfax a type of babysitter for Jane in some ways, and then Alice has to look after Bella in Eclipse. As far as all the books I've read so far that Bella enjoys, this is the one that has shocked me the most as far as its similarities go.
He looks miserable, poor soul.
Miserable he may be, but poor he most certainly is not.
Pride and Prejudice.
Yes, we are now talking about Pride and Prejudice and Twilight. So I know Jane Austen isn't for everyone, but I absolutely adore this book. I give it a 10 out of 10. I love it so much. It is easily one of my favorite books I've read so far this year. It is so funny and I love it. Welcome to a segment I like to call Pride and Parallels. I already wasted so much of your time, so I'm just going to try to rapid fire this one. Twilight was based off of Pride and Prejudice. Let's go through some of the parallels. First, you have an erratic, harebrained mother. This is Renee, Bella's mother, or Mrs. Bennet, Elizabeth's mother. Mr. Bennet and Elizabeth Bennet have very similar personalities in the way that Bella and Charlie have very similar personalities, and their relationships are also very similar.
I guess I'm kind of like my dad in that way.
The way that the characters are introduced, Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, is very similar to the way that the Cullens are introduced, and the films are very indicative of this. Now I want you to watch the following two scenes and tell me they are not the same.
So which of the painted peacocks is our Mr. Bingley?
Well, he's on the right, and on the left is his sister.
And the person with the quizzical brow?
That's Edward Cullen, but apparently nobody here is good enough for him.
You have the overly welcoming sister who's extremely kind and very excited to meet the protagonist, and when they do meet, they get along almost immediately. You also have the jealous beauty. The failed proposals. Bella rejects Mike when he asks her to the dance while Jessica accepts. Elizabeth rejects Mr. Collins, and Charlotte accepts. The rivalry between Mr. Wickham and Mr. Darcy is very similar to the rivalry between Mike and Edward. Bella gets a phone call believing James has taken her mother, and Elizabeth gets a letter that Lydia has run off with Mr. Wickham. Although there are no literal vampires in Pride and Prejudice, Mr. Wickham represents a literary vampire by preying on young, unassuming girls for money, and this is very similar to the characterization of James. Mrs. Young is incredibly loyal to Wickham in the same way that Victoria is loyal to James. Darcy sets aside his pride to deal with Wickham in the wedding for Elizabeth's sake, and Edward sets aside his pride to save Bella's life by extracting the venom. So I'm a huge fan of the 2005 film version of Pride and Prejudice. I think it is perfection. However, Bella is a huge fan of the BBC Pride and Prejudice series featuring Colin Firth. Yeah, that one, thanks. So I decided to sit down and watch the first 2 episodes.
Allow me the pleasure of welcoming you to our little assembly.
And then I did my hair. Oh, sorry, I thought it was... Anyways, I liked it. I thought it was right off the page and it was really great, but personally just a little too slow for my taste. Although I do understand why people adore this version so much. I do personally really like Colin Firth, and I do like him as Mr. Darcy. But the 2005 version still holds as my favorite
Never was a story of more woe than this, of Juliet and her Romeo.
So Romeo and Juliet is easily one of those plays that's just a 10 out of 10. There's so much more to theater than just Shakespeare, but I appreciate a good Shakespeare piece every now and then, and Romeo and Juliet is one of my personal favorites. So Romeo and Juliet is the play that inspired the story behind New Moon. New Moon is the first time that we see Bella actively reading the work that inspired the work. She has to read Romeo and Juliet for a school assignment. So where I would argue Pride and Prejudice and Twilight is more on the subtle side, the characters are directly comparing themselves to the characters within the story of Romeo and Juliet while their own story is actually happening. So let's make some comparisons. Here's the thing, I actually struggle a lot with this one. I struggle even more with the comparison between Eclipse and Wuthering Heights, but I struggle a lot with this one. So let's start off with our basics. We know that Bella is supposed to be the Juliet in this story, and Edward is the Romero. And their vampire-human relationship is forbidden. But unlike our OG star-crossed lovers who are driven apart by feuding families, Edward leaves Bella on his own accord because he believes it isn't safe for her. They're driven apart by their own individual choices, not feuding families. That, however, does not mean there aren't feuding families. Allow me to chart. Yes, I need a chart. So I made a chart. We have our Romeo and our Juliet. Now we need a Paris. Paris is the parentally approved love interest assigned to Juliet, and for that we turn to Jacob. In the role of the nurse, I throw in Alice Cullen because she operates as Bella's confidant. And then Rosalie is the messenger. Aside from those, there aren't any other character parallels that I picked up on. However, Embry and Jared give me Mercutio and Benvolio vibes. I don't know. Let me know what you think. It's time for the spiderweb. So first off, we have the Volturi, the vampire government hierarchy law enforcers. Then we have the wolves who shapeshift to protect from vampires. And finally, we have the Cullens, a vampire clan who live in Fork, which Edward is a part of, and the wolves have shapeshift specifically because the Cullens are there. However, the Cullens leave, but the boys are still shapeshifting into wolves because of Victoria and Laurent. Victoria is seeking revenge on Bella for the death of James because she really is trying to get back at Edward by killing Bella. Laurent is working beside Victoria, however he has no problem killing Bella himself. And the Volturi also wants to unalive Bella because she's a mortal who knows of the existence of vampires and Edward has no intention on changing her. So Edward is in love with Bella, Bella is in love with Edward, Edward leaves, Jacob's in love with Bella, Bella thinks she may love Jacob, but she really just gets along with him. Anyways, Edward is a member of the Cullen clan, so is Carlisle. Carlisle used to be part of the Volturi, but left the Volturi because the Volturi still consumes human blood, whereas the Cullens refer to themselves as vegetarians because they only consume the blood of animals. And the Volturi and the Cullens don't get along, especially because they want Bella unalived, and the wolves and the Cullens don't get along because they're vampires. Also, turning Bella into a vampire would break the treaty. The Cullens are against the Volturi, the Cullens are against the wolves and the Volturi don't know of each other's existence. So the Cullens are just kind of going around and making a lot of enemies. Bella doesn't get along with the Volturi, Bella gets along with the wolves, and Bella is also considered a member of the Cullen family despite not being a vampire herself. So she's part of two of the groups and opened welcomely into their families, but there's no blood relation, so it still gets a little messy as far as the terminology of family feuds. But because they're dealing with the wolves who are practically a family and then the Cullens who are actually family, it's feuding families, but they don't really have much of a feud because the Cullens have left Forks, so there's not really much to feud over. But then this is made even more confusing because there's the whole forbidden love aspect of the story. In the story of Romeo and Juliet, the love story between Romeo and Juliet is the most irrelevant part of the actual story, and to put that love story at the forefront of the story is kind of weird. The main theme behind Romeo and Juliet is gender roles and not following society's expectations, with Romeo and Juliet respectively breaking these gender roles. But Twilight doesn't do that. The entire series pretty much reinforces gender roles. But back to New Moon. Bella goes to save Edward and stop him from unaliving himself because he thinks that she's dead because Alice saw her jump off a cliff and then couldn't see her because Jacob rescued her, and Rosalie tells Edward this information, but it was a misunderstanding. Bella is able to save him in the end. Aside from that, there's not really any more parallels that it could pick out of the story, but I'd love to hear any and all of your thoughts. I think what's most interesting about New Moon in relation to Romeo and Juliet is it's really the first time as the reader we see Bella comparing her life to the lives of the characters in the stories she reads. And as far as theme comparison goes, I actually think Romeo and Juliet is more fitting for Eclipse. In Eclipse, Bella is faced with choosing between the life she wants to live versus the life she's expected to live. But where Romeo and Juliet is a social and gender commentary, Twilight is none of those things. I think I did a pretty good job of not doing my whole Romeo and Juliet rant, so I think we're ready to talk about the gender roles, talk about the more interesting aspects of Romeo and Juliet, because if what you're taking out of it is a love story, I'm concerned. And I would argue it's inappropriate because it pushes the boundaries of glorifying unaliving yourself.
Also, if you're in a relationship and you're like, oh my god, we're like Romeo and Juliet, we're forbidden lovers because you're cheating on another person, if your love is forbidden because you are in another relationship, you're not Romeo and Juliet, you're just...
Anyways, let's move on to the...
Broke my heart. You killed me.
So I know Wuthering Heights isn't for everyone, but I really did enjoy it, especially since I really like the gothic genre. I think Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre are somewhat similar. They focus on domestic life, but there's a lot of drama to them, and reading Wuthering Heights felt like the equivalent of watching an 1800s reality show. The book itself is also somewhat complex, so I had to do a lot of research while reading it and look at different charts and family trees to figure out exactly which characters I was reading about and when. But I really enjoyed it, even though I'm not the biggest fan of tragedies. So as I mentioned earlier, the story has completely eluded me. I really don't understand the comparisons that are trying to be made in Eclipse to Wuthering Heights, but I really don't see it, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Now, like Romeo and Juliet and New Moon, Eclipse is just another example of the characters making references to their literary predecessors. Bella even has an incredibly old and worn out copy of the book that she's read plenty of times. Edward and her make comparisons of themselves to the characters. These comparisons are incredibly confusing. Number one, because every single character in Wuthering Heights is a bad person. You won't come out of it liking a single character, which is even more confusing when you consider the comparisons trying to be made between Catherine and Bella. Bella is not only our protagonist through the series, but she's also our narrator, and she's an incredibly likable character. She's relatable, she's funny, she's sarcastic, very stubborn, and we're supposed to believe in this love story that they're trying to tell, which is the complete antithesis of Catherine Earnshaw. In Midnight Sun, Edward makes it very clear that Bella is a really good person. She looks out for other people, she cares for others, and takes time to be a very nurturing individual. In Wuthering Heights, we have a lot of unreliable narrators and second-hand accounts of events that have happened, but because of that, we also get a lot of outsider descriptions of observations between Heathcliff and Catherine. And Catherine is not described this way. She's described as incredibly selfish. Then you also take the comparison of Heathcliff and Edward, which again confuses me a lot. Edward does incredibly dodgy and questionable things, especially in the films. At times, they made changes which made Edward look even worse than he actually is in the books, and that's kind of weird, and then they try to make Jacob look better while also looking worse. Anyways, despite all of Edward's bad qualities, I wouldn't compare him to Heathcliff. Bella and Edward even acknowledge that Catherine and Heathcliff aren't good people. And Bella even makes the comment that their love is really their only redeeming quality. But even in the case of Edward and Bella, where we're following their love story, it's not their only redeeming quality. They aren't these terrible people, and we're never made to believe truly that they are. The only true similarity I can see between these two couples is that, like Bella and Edward, Catherine and Heathcliff never stopped loving each other. And I also want to make it very clear that when I use the term love, I'm using it very loosely here. Ultimately, they are the couples we are rooting for, but only one of them has their truly happy ending together, whereas the other one is incredibly tragic. And if we were to follow the love triangle in Wuthering Heights, in the end, Catherine chooses Linton, which doesn't exactly parallel Bella and Edward because their relationships are so different. Catherine and Linton are more of an arranged marriage, whereas Bella and Edward, again very loosely here, are in love. So in that way, Eclipse is Wuthering Heights if it had a happy ending, I guess. I personally think Catherine and Heathcliff ending up together would have been a somewhat happy ending because they may not have been so miserable. Also, at the very least, they could be terrible together and not hurt other people in the process. Because even though the people around Edward and Bella are affected by their choices to an extent, none of their problems really are problems. An army of vampires is sent after us? No problem. We'll just defeat them in like 30 minutes. Okay, maybe it didn't take like 30 minutes, but still it was a super short battle. I'm just trying to say there was really no conflict there. The wolves are after us. That's okay, we'll just defeat them in, again, like a 10-minute battle. Another vampire army is sent after us, except this time it's the Volturi full of vampires who are incredibly powerful. But that's okay, we won't really even have to fight because Alice can just show them what happens and how we'll ultimately defeat them. Getting married at 18? No problem there. Renee, who seemingly would care and have issue with it, has no issue with it at all. Want to see your parents again? Alright, here you go. Because of course Bella develops a very strong tolerance to be around human blood despite being a literal newborn. Which, like, hey, good for her. That takes a lot of strength. Even when Edward feels bad and conflicted over the fact that he can't provide Bella with a normal human life and can't provide her with children, it's fixed because they have a baby anyway. Where Wuthering Heights is a tragedy, Twilight is the complete antithesis of that. Every single problem, no matter how minute, is fixed. And I wouldn't say this is the result of perfect character syndrome because by no means are any of these characters perfect. But again, it's not like they possess the flaws that exist in Wuthering Heights either. The only real conflict throughout the books, which is only in like halfway through the series, is the love triangle between Bella, Jacob, and Edward, but it's a very one-sided triangle because Bella doesn't love Jacob in the way that he loves her, and she really just loves Edward, and we know Bella and Edward are going to end up with each other in the end, so there's no real conflict. Every single problem in this series just kind of figures itself out, and the more dynamic and interesting stories like the backstories of the Cullens don't really get that much attention because they aren't the main characters, and there really isn't any room made for them to play with these backstories outside of Jasper's war experience. But it's not like we ever really get to see Alice deep diving into her very tragic past to figure out more. And Rosalie's backstory is incredibly interesting, but we really don't get to deep dive into it truly. Because by the end of the series, even after her backstory is revealed, Rosalie is diminished to this incredibly self-centered, selfish, and self-obsessed person. And this idea is heavily driven forward by Midnight Sun, in which Edward can, of course, hear what people are thinking, and he relays a lot of Rosalie's thoughts, which tend to be about herself. Rosalie, like a lot of the characters in the classics to come before her, falls into the archetype of the 1800s mean girl. Ultimately, her role is to not like the protagonist and to sit there and be pretty. That is her entire role. Other characters that I classify as the mean girl in classic literature are Catherine de Bourgh and Caroline Bingley, with the latter I think being the best example of this, because ultimately Caroline's role within the story of Pride and Prejudice is to be snobbish, even rude, and to represent social upstanding in society. She is highly regarded and dignified and has a high social status and lives up to it. She's well-mannered and very feminine, and her role is to be the antithesis of the protagonist. She serves almost as a competition and a way for the protagonist to feel inadequate, and she's portrayed this way as a comparison so that when the love interest chooses the protagonist, it's to show that he's not obsessed with status. Because of course it's not about those things. In the end, he chooses the unconventionally attractive protagonist. He doesn't care about wealth and status, he chooses love. And I really do think Rosalie deserved better. And before I close out, here are 2 honorable mentions. These are books that Bella likes but don't necessarily relate to the series. First up, we have Little Women, which is actually a favorite of Bella's and is also a favorite of mine, so of course I had to give it 5 stars. The thing is, Little Women is so vastly different from the Twilight series. Like Romeo and Juliet, it makes a lot of feminist, social, and gender commentary, which Twilight just doesn't do. but I can understand some of the comparisons between Jo March and Bella. Next up, we have To Kill a Mockingbird, and this is another favorite of mine, so of course, 5 stars, 10 out of 10, highly recommend. In Midnight Sun, Edward also compares Bella to Scout, which I actually think is a pretty fair comparison given their very curious natures and constant hunt for the truth, which can get them in some pretty dangerous situations. Because Bella as a character sees the world through books, you can tell that a lot of these classic books had a huge influence on how the Twilight books were written and how Bella's character was constructed. And because Bella is somewhat of a self-insert character, I think this not only reveals a lot about her characterization, but it also reveals a lot about Stephanie as a person and how she wrote the series. One thing that I do want to note is that taking inspiration from these classic books didn't always have the best influence on these stories. In Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, for example, there's a lot of emphasis on whiteness and the beauty of whiteness, and this same theme is represented a lot in the Twilight saga, so much so that when it came to casting for the screen, Stephanie was adamant that the vampires be book accurate and all be cast white, and one exception was made for Eddie Gathagi after a lot of back and forth with the creative team between Stephanie, and she finally agreed to that much. Twilight Saga carries with it this racism. It also carries a lot of these problematic tropes and romanticization of toxic behavior, especially in men. I think the best example of this type of carryover is the comparisons between Edward Rochester and Edward Cullen, who, as I mentioned before, are incredibly problematic for their possessive tendencies. But then you also have the other side of this, which is Bella's characterization, which takes a lot of very strong personality traits from these old protagonists. But then there's also the misuse of tropes like Romeo and Juliet versus New Moon, in which Romeo and Juliet is shown to be this forbidden lovers, we cannot be together, therefore we won't be here at all type of story, when it's so much more nuanced than that. I also think Rosalie's archetype could have been taken a step further, but instead her character just kind of faltered at the end by revolving back into her selfishness. I was playing it really safe with my choices by just going through a lot of the classics that she likes, but there's so much more to get through, so we'll see what happens. So far though, I'll say that Bella's taste is very basic and safe. And is that a bad thing? Not necessarily, because they're good, it's good literature, but it is rather safe. And before I close out this video, here's a friendly reminder to check out the Move to Higher Ground project. More information is in the description. To my fellow writers out there, please consider the influence your work could potentially have and how you want it to do so, especially if you are inspired by classic literature. What ideas do you want to leave behind, and what do you carry with you? Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it this far, first of all, thank you, and please comment, "This is the skin of a killer." I hope you have a wonderful day, stay awesome, and I hope to catch you next time. Bye!